Well, if you had Willson Contreras throwing the gauntlet down on the front office for the Cardinals, collect your winnings at the window. What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of b-schaeff Daily. Brenden Schaeffer here with you, the morning hours of Monday, September 23rd, 2024. Of course, the Cardinals have been eliminated from postseason contention for 2024. We know this by now. But now the conversation shifts to what's next. And for Cardinals catcher Willson Contreras, he wants to see that mean some targeted changes within the Cardinals front office and the roster itself here in St. Louis. Contreras had some interesting quotes that he delivered to some of the beat writers there at Busch Stadium on Sunday. That was the final home game of the regular season for the Cardinals. They'll head out on the road trip and wrap up 2024 out in Denver and San Francisco over the coming week. But Contreras, of course, finishing the season on the injured list. This was going to be the last time anybody would have a chance to talk with him. And we know this about Willson Contreras by now. He's a fiery guy. He's a guy that wears his heart and his emotions on his sleeve. And a lot of times, too, when he has a thought about something, he'll say it with his whole chest. And that seems to be what it was on Sunday afternoon at Busch Stadium when he delivered these quotes. I'm going to read them courtesy of Jeff Jones. He covers the Cardinals for the Belleville News-Democrat and wrote a whole story with these quotes. So make sure to go read his story on this conversation because everything is about to begin, really, for the Cardinals. 2024 is ending the regular season, but that's just the beginning of what comes next for an organization that has to have change at this point. And that certainly means change and adjustments that have to be made to the roster, but I think more so than anything, we're going to see change in the front office and change in the way that the organization is run for the first time in a long time. Exactly what form those changes are going to take is anybody's guess at this point, but within the next couple of weeks, I think we're going to get some answers on a way forward. And whether that's going to be something that energizes the Cardinals fan base or whether it puts y'all into wait-and-see mode of, okay, I see some shifting is happening here, but what's that ultimately going to mean? A lot of questions certainly are going to have to be answered in the weeks ahead and then the months that follow as to how significant of an overhaul are the Cardinals going to undergo here in order to try to get things back on track, because there's no arguing at this point in time that there's not a decline. There's no arguing that the Cardinals are heading in the right organizational direction. It's just inarguable. You can't have two seasons in a row where you fall woefully short of expectations. This year, the final week, you're completely out of contention mathematically. Last year, it was basically the whole month of September that you felt like it was over. I think within the last couple of weeks is when that became mathematically the case for the Cardinals last year. But that's 2 years in a row that you entered a season expecting to contend, and 2 years in a row where you fell pretty far short of doing it. And as a result of that, regardless of the cohesion and the continuity that we've seen throughout the Cardinals organization over John Mozeliak's tenure, that's all well and good, but continuity without production and without performance and without getting the organization and the team to where it needs to be come October is valueless. And now it's time to shift it a little bit. It's time to shake things up a little bit. This was going to happen regardless along a similar timeline because we knew after John Mozeliak announced, or the Cardinals announced John Mozeliak's contract extension in February of 2023, that this extension, this deal that he's under would be the last of his tenure as president of baseball operations. So we knew that at the latest, after 2025, he was going to be ushering in a different era, and Mozeliak was going to be departing. Now, we know it's a strong likelihood, that Mo is going to finish out his contract, which runs through that 2025 season. He's not going to be fired, right? That would be a surprise to me at this point. And I've been consistent about that, so if it comes to pass a different way, then, I'm going to be here and say, yeah, I got it wrong. But my prediction is that John Mozeliak finishes the contract, but in what role? Does he remain the president of baseball operations beyond the next couple of weeks? Or does that shift? Does he remain pretty hands-on but announces and the Cardinals identify, hey, this is who's taken over after one more year and this is going to be a transitional year? Is that a possibility? Does Mo kind of move into the background right away, a la David Stearns when he was running the Milwaukee Brewers and then said, look, I'm going to kind of take a step back here. I'm still under contract, but he was no longer the day-to-day operational executive that was making all of the big decisions pertaining to the baseball operations of the Brewers at that point. This was a couple of years ago. He's now, of course, with the New York Mets. But that's still a possibility. And then where does Chaim Bloom fit into all of this is obviously going to be something that we're anxious to see the answer regarding, and I think it's going to be a prominent bump for Chaim Bloom. Does that mean Cardinals make him the director of player development? Does that mean the Cardinals give him the keys to the kingdom as the president of baseball operations, or if they decide to title him as the general manager? I think he would be probably something similar. I think the POBO is going to remain the way that is organized, and then there will be maybe some changes underneath him. What happens to Randy Flores? What happens to Mike Gerst? What happens to the other assistant GMs and those folks in the front office? Obviously, the player development director position, Gary LaRocque, departing. He's retiring, and so that's going to have to be a hole that's filled. We have seen Chaim Bloom be around the Cardinals all year. He's been, the way that John Mozeliak has described it, working on a special project for him. Really, I think that's more of an audit of the organization, top to bottom, as the Cardinals look to maybe catch back up, because they had the edge over Major League Baseball for a long, long time. They did. They were ahead of the curve. It's a credit to Bill DeWitt at the time when they looked at the way that they were doing business in the mid-20-aughts. 20-aughts? It's not really how that's said. Doesn't matter. You know what I'm talking about. Around 2007, when the Cardinals missed the playoffs after winning the World Series in 2006, they said the way that we've conducted business was successful, but the game has changed and we need to change with it. And that's why they elevated John Mozeliak at that point in time, fired Walt Jocketty. That was a firing, and that was a bold move, given there was good continuity and consistency there within the organization at that point in time. But Bill DeWitt made the decision, the business decision, that had to be done, because the Cardinals had fallen behind and they wanted to reinvest in player development. They wanted to reinvest in a new way forward. And the Cardinals, for the better part of the next 15 years or so, you can make the case that for a long, long time, the Cardinals had the edge. Well, that edge is gone. And when exactly it departed is up for interpretation. A lot of different people might have different opinions on that, because you could go all the way back to 2015 when the Cardinals had the 100-win season. They won the Central, but they ended up losing to the Cubs in that playoff round. I think there were 3 teams that were right around 100 wins that year in the NL Central, if I recall correctly. And the Cubs, of course, won the World Series the following year in 2016, as the Cardinals missed the playoffs a few times. They fired a manager, Mike Matheny. They brought in Schilt. They had a little bit of a bump there for a couple of years. They fired Schilt. Ollie Marmol's first year was a successful one, but another early playoff exit. Cardinals have not been back to the World Series since 2013. Like, all of these things are swirling around, and now it seems like that it's just become very clear that the edge is gone, and the Cardinals need to reclaim it. So that's going to come from, I think, a lot of changes internally. And to make those changes, you kind of do have to have some outside perspective. As much as they have valued continuity, there will be changes. Changes are coming. But I want to address a little bit more, because that's like the helicopter view, right? That's a 10,000-foot view. But if you're Willson Contreras, you're boots on the ground. You're in that clubhouse. You recognize what the roster is and what it isn't. And for as much as we have tried to look at this Cardinal lineup and say, hey, there are pieces there, we look at the bright side. We say there are a bunch of guys who are solid players, but they do probably need a couple of players performing like stars that didn't this year. What's that mean for Goldschmidt? What's that mean for Arenado? Those two had carried you, and then they didn't this year, plain and simple. And whether or not that's anybody's fault in particular, the guys decline as they age. If it was just an anomaly for them to have seasons as rough as they did, does that lead to the Cardinals moving on from Goldschmidt? Probably. What happens with Arenado? Is he needing to buy into the organizational direction? Are the Cardinals potentially looking to put him on the block this offseason because of financial constraints? Like, a lot of different things can happen. But if you're Willson Contreras, you want the team to be better. You want the team to win more games, and you want the team to be more productive, because you're still under contract and part of this thing. So that's where his comments come into play. I'm going to read them now, courtesy of Jeff Jones, again, of Belleville News, because he tweeted a pretty good bit of what Willson had to say, it appears. Here's a quote. I'm just going to read it for you. Quote, "There's some areas that need to be addressed," Willson Contreras said Sunday afternoon. Quote, "I don't know if the front office is going to, but we didn't come together as an offense at all during the whole year. There's a lot of holes throughout the lineup as well, from 1 to 9. The only thing we can control is show up next year and keep working. But as an organization, I think the Cardinals are one of the biggest organizations in baseball. And if I was them, if I was the front office, I'd have to be hungry to own this division." That is the kind of talk that I know Cardinals fans can appreciate. Continued, Willson said, "We haven't owned this division the last 2 years." Then he was asked, what areas need help? Willson said, "That's a good question for the front office to answer. I'm not going to answer that question. But I think if you look at the numbers as an offense, you will notice what's probably missing. And then one more quote from Jeff from Willson. As a group, we need to make an adjustment next year for sure. So Willson Contreras is calling out the front office. Pretty plain and clear. But he's also, in some ways, calling out his teammates. That's what's so tricky when you talk about roster stuff is if you say, well, you look 1 through 9, we just didn't have enough. We got holes throughout the lineup. Well, what's that say about the guys that are batting in those spots? It's an easier thing to say at the end of the year, for sure, than when you're in the middle of the year. But for a guy that is as competitive as Willson Contreras is and wants to win like he does, if you're not going to say it now, when are you going to say it, right? Like, you want to challenge the front office in that way, I think. If you know you're going to be a part of this next year, you know that changes are imminent, you look at the lineup and say, man, we weren't productive enough offensively this season. It's hard to do that in a tactful way, right? Because you're certainly going to potentially rub some people the wrong way because those are your teammates. And there's some point of view that would say, well, that's being a bad teammate to call out your own team. And the year's not even quite over. His year's over, but they're going out on a road trip and going to play some more baseball to finish things out. But I don't have a single problem with what Willson Contreras said, to be honest with you. Let me know if you agree or disagree. But this is the guy that, again, he is a cornerstone piece of this franchise right now. He is under contract for more seasons. He's here. He's a fixture. And as a fixture and I think ostensibly a team leader, if it's not him that's going to say it, who's it going to be? Because Goldschmidt's out the door is the way that it's feeling. Arenado, we know that Arenado and the way that he approaches the media is different. Arenado doesn't quite like to speak his mind in that way, and Willson Contreras is a little bit more apt to do it. And we know that, too, that Arenado has been, and he had to talk about this at times throughout the year, that, when he is personally struggling, he's not been the guy that is still able to rally the troops behind him. He's kind of off, downing on himself and trying to figure out a way to fix his own struggles so that he can be a leader through example and through production. But a leader that is going to be vocal and say, hey, here's what needs to happen, Arenado is not always as apt to do that, and that's just different strokes for different folks. I'm not saying that is a bad thing. Arenado is still under contract, so you figure he's going to be here unless there's a request for him not to be here or a decision from the Cardinals that is financially related. Now, if that comes to fruition, you're going to find one pissed off Willson Contreras, I imagine. Just in general, I think if the Cardinals aren't investing in the team, again, he talked about 1 through 9, there being holes in the lineup. So I think that is a challenge from Willson. I don't know if that challenge is going to hold up to exactly the way that the front office plans to do it this offseason. Spend a bunch of money to fix the offense. I don't know about that. But I think you do. I've talked about hard decisions need to be made because you've got a lot of guys that are not necessarily making a ton of money, but they're supposed to be more productive than they were this year. And they all were kind of like fine and average, but where's the star power coming from? Willson can be one of those bats still in the middle of the order next year, but he needs some help. And if Arenado is not going to be the answer that he's been in years past, he wasn't this year, then you certainly do. If this is a team that is hell-bent on contending in 2025, Willson Contreras is spot on. Some changes have got to be made. And that's just talking about the offense. The pitching is going to be a similar story of, okay, how do you improve the unit? Because you can look across the board at the way the Cardinals rank in various categories this year, and it's not very impressive. Right now, they're tied for 19th, basically 20th, on the borderline of being a bottom 10 unit offensively, because OPS, they're sub 700. Tied with the Oakland Athletics is where the Cardinals are in that category right now. Just giving you the numbers. Offensively, runs scored. They're 25th in baseball. 635 runs scored through 156 games. 6 games to go during this Cardinals season. And yeah, they did win on Sunday. Andre Palante was really good. He's a pitcher. He's a starting pitcher for you next year. But what else happens? What else ends up having to happen for the Cardinals to get it back on track? Their ERA, mid-pack, 4.05 ERA, 16th in baseball this season. But if you isolate that between the starting rotation and the bullpen, starting rotation lags behind a little bit, 4.35 ERA, 22nd in starters ERA for the Cardinals, or I should say are the Cardinals. Season's not over. 6 games to wrap things up. The bullpen has been very good. 3.65 ERA, 7th in baseball. The problem is bullpen ERA from year to year is not necessarily one of those things that you can project. Like how is it going to stay the same? How is it going to change? What do you do with some of the tough roster decisions or business decisions as it pertains to Ryan Helsley. Guys like JoJo Romero. Andrew Kittredge could be coming back, but he's not under contract. JoJo is under team control, I believe. Helsley, of course, has one more year left, but is going to get a huge pay raise, as he deserves, for the way he's pitching this year. Is the bullpen going to be the same strength it was next year? If not, you have to do the tweaks that can allow it to at least remain in that range, because it was a top 10 unit this year. Had to be for the Cardinals to be successful, and the bullpen did its part. Rotation had to be, I think, around a top 20-ish unit for the Cardinals to be successful this year. It didn't have to be elite. It just had to be passable after it was really bad last year in 2023. Well, it largely did what I think you could have expected it to do. 4.35 starters ERA is 22nd in baseball. Nobody's gonna be over the moon about that, but they went out and got veterans that were low upside, high floor. Guys like Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson. Yes, Sonny was supposed to have a higher ceiling than he put together this year. He pitched okay. 22nd in starters ERA at 4.35 is around what you could hope for. Maybe you want to see it be a little bit better. That's fair. But what had to happen was the offense improve from being a bottom 10 unit, and it didn't. They're 25th in runs scored. So when Willson Contreras, he's not naming names, but he can just say, look, 1 through 9, we're 25th in runs scored. We cannot expect to contend that way. The offense was supposed to be the unit that carried the team this year, and it did not. So it's not wrong of Willson Contreras to say what he said. We're saying the same things out here. I don't know the exact answers. I don't know if you say, no, it means you have to trade Nolan Gorman because he wasn't productive enough. If it means you have to trade Lars Nootbaar. Some of these guys are going to be cornerstone pieces still. Guys who had down years, but they're going to have to bounce back if the Cardinals are going to make it work, because I don't see a spending spree in free agency. Could there be some targeted trades that happen where they bring in the right guy or two and suddenly the whole lineup looks different? Because everybody's got a 700 OPS except for your center fielder and Jordan Walker. But Walker's going to next year. He just has to. Or, they're going to have to put their eggs in that basket. And if it doesn't pan out, then that's going to be part of the reason the Cardinals continue to struggle to flourish. But could there be a couple of targeted moves where all those guys with 700 OPSs, 720 OPSs, 740 OPSs, you trade one or two, you bring in guys that are the right fit, and it's not to say any of these individuals are the wrong fit or that I've identified it who's the wrong fit. I think the wrong fit is Nolan Gorman's OPS, is Jordan Walker's OPS. That doesn't mean those are the guys that you should get rid of. It might be, but it also might be the guys that you have to be stubborn and throw your weight behind, because that's the only way forward for an organization that continues to fall short offensively. The exact answers are going to be somebody else's job to determine, and it may not even be John Mozeliak. Mo might take a small or a big step back at this point, and then the decision makers could be coming from other sources. That's what we're going to find out over the next couple of weeks. I assume there will be an end-of-season press conference this time because they've got some news to announce one way or another. So that's kind of where it is. But if you're Willson Contreras, you're thinking about the bigger picture of the organization, because you know that some of the guys here may or may not be here next year, but Wilson's one of them that will be. And you want to win, so you say the things that you said to the reporters yesterday at Busch. Again, check out the beat writers that were there. I was not there for Sunday, regrettably. Took the family to the Mizzou game Saturday, didn't get back in time. It is what it is. But that's where it is right now. Willson Contreras speaking his mind, challenging the front office, and we'll see if the front office ends up being largely the same or if there are the significant changes that we think could be coming. And then a scenario where the people making these really tough decisions about the roster and the way forward are ultimately not exactly the same group that has gotten you here in the first place. Which I think for a lot of Cardinals fans, you're going to be excited about that, because I do think they need another perspective. I think Mozeliak found a way to make sure the bottom didn't fall out of 2024, but that clearly didn't get the fan base engaged. It didn't get people excited because it resulted in another non-playoff season. It was a half measure. And while I understood the impetus behind that to say, all right, here's the way that we kind of get back on track, ultimately it required the offense to be better than it was. So you can't just look at the offense and say, hey, let's run it back for a third year in a row, essentially. I don't think that works. That doesn't mean necessarily more spending, because we have to understand, whether we like it or not, I think ownership is in a spot where they're not going to significantly raise payroll. But you can always spend more effectively. I've not really ever had a huge issue, to the extent that Cardinals fans have, with the nature of their spending as far as the dollar amount on payroll. I think you got to make your dollar stretch further. some of the money that's spent is on those low upside investments where you're paying for things that in theory you should be able to develop that type of production internally and have those guys churned out through the system that are providing number 4 starter, number 5 starter numbers without spending $11 million on it. God bless Lance Lynn. God bless Kyle Gibson. If you had those internal options, you could have then said, hey, what's this team missing elsewhere? What's this team missing offensively to be able to get over the hump? And they just weren't in a position to be able to do that because of how bad the starting pitching depth and just the rotation top to bottom was last year in 2023. They had to try and staunch the bleeding a little bit and see if they could get lucky with the offense all taking a step forward collectively. They didn't. You arguably had everybody collectively at least take a step back. Obviously, guys like Burleson and Mason Wynn emerged as options who weren't in 2023, but collectively the others largely stepped backwards a little bit to where the offense is 25th in runs scored. So that's where the Cardinals are. But I don't disagree with what Willson Contreras said. I just think it's one of those things that it's going to be difficult to ascertain exactly how the Cardinals are going to go about it if they're not raising payroll. But that's the beauty of it. The guy that's in charge is going to have to decide. That's the business of baseball. Tough decisions are going to have to be made, I think, by this front office. I'm not saying the fans are going to love each of them when they happen. If the Cardinals trade away a player that you're like, oh, man, I thought that guy was part of the future. If that happens, there are going to be reactions and emotions surrounding that when the deal takes place. If at the end of 2025 it results in the Cardinals being in a better position because of the targeted moves that they made, then that's really what it's all about. So I'm going to try to reserve judgment. We're going to react to everything that happens, but also do so while recognizing there could be a grander plan in place, and you might have to trust the Cardinal organization, whoever's in charge, if it's Chaim Bloom, if it's still partially Mo. You don't have to be happy about it if it's Mo, but you, as a Cardinals fan, like, this is what's coming. So I'm very curious to see how substantial these changes are going to be, not only within the front office, but tweaking that roster to make it better for next year, make it better and potentially doing more with less, and less being from a payroll perspective. That's why I think Chaim Bloom would make a lot of sense to elevate in this front office, because he's made a career of doing more with less. That's what happened in Tampa. That's what he helped to build there with the Rays way. And then when he goes to Boston, they said, you have to do what we do with less because the payroll's going down and Mookie Betts has got to go because we're not signing him. And then he had to make tough decisions. Could that be a situation that faces Chaim Bloom this offseason if he truly elevates to that level within the front office? We will see. These are my thoughts. We're going to continue with B-Schaeff Daily throughout the offseason. Appreciate you guys for being on board. Appreciate you for listening and for making this channel what it's been. We're going to continue to kind of cover everything going on with the Cardinals. So I appreciate you guys and your support. As always, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and consider a channel membership as well if you'd like to support the channel that way. Those links are always in the link, the video description below. So thank you guys so much for watching and listening. We'll talk to you next time on B-Schaeff Daily. Peace.